When Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the idea was to offer federal protection for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act said you could not have your right to vote infringed upon in any way by a poll tax or a literacy test or by intimidation of any kind. Voting was important, it was constitutionally protected, and so Congress ordered federal protection for it. Even if states wanted to infringe that right, the federal government would not let them do it. The Voting Rights Act passed both chambers of Congress by wide margins. Republicans, incidentally, supported it by wider margins than Democrats did. Democrats at the time, of course, were still infested with their Dixiecrats. When it came time to re-up the Voting Rights Act, to extend key sections of it in 2006, the Senate voted to do that by a vote of 98-0. Now, in parts of the country that have historically had trouble with voting rights or voter turnout, the Voting Rights Act requires extra federal scrutiny of state actions whenever they want to change their voting rules. They're subject to extra scrutiny that they have earned to make sure they're not changing their laws in ways that infringe on the constitutional right to vote. That's why you've got this extra hurdle of federal approval that a lot of these Republican-controlled jurisdictions have had to go through this year when they've been trying to change their state laws to make it harder to vote. So in South Carolina, Republican Governor Nikki Haley is saying she wants her state's new barrier to voting approved in time for the November election. In Virginia, Governor McDonnell took a break from chairing the Republican National Platform Committee yesterday to celebrate his state's new law getting federal clearance, along with the promise of a free ID card to be mailed to every Virginia voter. In Florida, Republican Governor Rick Scott signed a law this year that cuts the days for early voting from 14 days to 8 days. But Rick Scott's state has 5 counties that get this special scrutiny under the Voting Rights Act. And a few days ago, a federal court ruled that Florida may not cut early voting in those 5 special counties. But check this out. If you look at the specifics here, you will understand what the giant drama is going on now in Florida. The court ruled that if those 5 counties under special supervision agreed to hold longer voting hours on weekdays, then maybe the state could get away with cutting out the weekend voting that has been so popular, in particular with African-American voters. Rick Scott considered that idea and thought maybe he could work with it a little. Maybe he could get what he wanted after all in time for the November election. Rick Scott's Republican administration in Florida began approaching the elections clerks in these 5 counties. They asked the clerks to please go along. Please tell the courts that they like Rick Scott's idea for cutting out weekend voting and for just making the weekday voting longer instead. And as of yesterday, of the 5 election supervisors, 4 of them said, sure, we'll do what Rick Scott is asking. Fewer voting days? Okay, we'll take fewer voting days. But the 5th supervisor says, you know what? Early voting works great, as it is in his county. It's the Florida Keys. He says letting people vote on the weekend there makes a difference in that district. It's not just a matter of staying open later on the weeknights. He told Governor Scott, nope, he is not budging. And so, standoff. You might remember a similar standoff we've been reporting on in Ohio. In that state, it's 2 county election commissioners who want to continue weekend voting over the Republican Secretary of State's strenuous objections. Ohio's Secretary of State, as we've reported, is threatening to fire those local commissioners. Ohio doesn't receive special scrutiny under the Voting Rights Act, although maybe it should, given that state officials there are so determined to make voting harder. But regardless, these 5 counties in Florida do get that extra scrutiny under the Voting Rights Act, which again, Republicans used to like. In all but one of the counties, the election supervisors have signed on for Rick Scott's plan to cut the number of early voting days. But guess what happened to the guy who's the holdout? Guess what happened to the one supervisor who said no to this plan? Today, Rick Scott he hinted that maybe he's going to fire that guy. Governor Scott released a statement saying, quote, moving forward, I will continue to take all necessary and appropriate action to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. Whatever it takes to get what Rick Scott wants. Mr. Sawyer here is the resisting local elections official. He happens to be a Republican. He told the Miami Herald that it is clear that Rick Scott is trying to intimidate him. But he said that the attempt is not working. He is not scared. That lone Republican supervisor in South Florida stands out, not just in Florida, but in Republican politics at large. I mean, the standard used to be that Republicans supported the Voting Rights Act. Now, Texas Republicans are openly calling for the repeal of the Voting Rights Act in their state platform. This weekend, in the same interview where he offered his theory about rape and pregnancy, Congressman Todd Akin suggested that the states should be allowed to do whatever they want with elections.
Elections have historically always been a state thing. And I didn't realize how important or how good that was until we had that very close race, the second race with George Bush, and you had something that goes wrong in Florida. And I'm thinking, boy, it sure is good that the states manage this and not the federal government. Otherwise, you'd have to try and rehold the whole election process.
Yeah, historically, before the Voting Rights Act, Mr. Aiken's office later clarified that he does believe that voting is a fundamental right, trying to make him sound not too fringy on that issue either. Todd Aiken is not out on some fringe. His views on abortion happen to be shared by the very top of the Republican national presidential ticket. And his view that voting rights should be left to the states. Whatever they want to do with them, that view found a home today in the Republican Party platform. Platform committee chaired by Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell voted to support states that are trying to make voting harder by making you show new kinds of ID you didn't used to have to show in order to vote, new kinds of documentation that millions of Americans do not have. Then Republicans added a plank requiring that you newly prove your citizenship in order to vote. The voice vote on that one was unanimous. It is the new Republican consensus. Half a century ago, the consensus in the Republican Party and in this country was that we should make it easier to vote. As a nation, we liked voting, or at least we were embarrassed to admit otherwise. That was the consensus. But that was then. Now in 2012, that consensus is falling apart.